Got it? Okay.
Thank you. Marcia's my diligent backup.
Recording artist, yeah.
For good reason, yeah.
Great.
Oh, they're coming in.
Gonna shut my door real quick. So good morning, folks. As you're joining the room, Denise Ellsworth with the Ohio State University Department of Entomology. Welcome to the 1-week virtual insect university and our 10 o'clock webinar. We'll start in about 5 minutes. If you've been coming to other sessions, you are familiar with the details by now. The Q&A box is what we'll use for your questions. So if you have questions as we go, you can type them into that box. On your Zoom bar, you can tap on Q&A to get that box to expand. And we'll save those questions for the very end. We also have a chat box. You probably have to tap on the ... the ellipse at the end to get the chat box option. But that way you can put in any procedural questions if you're having trouble with your connection, that sort of thing. And we'll do our best to troubleshoot for you. We'll get started in a few minutes. We do have a web page for the webinar series, and I put that address as a hot link into the chat box. It's also on the screen in front of you, the go.osu.edu/insectu. And that has links and resources from all of our presenters this week. It also has now 3 of our webinars. If you weren't able to come to Jamie on Monday, Heather on Tuesday, or Olivia yesterday, we have those recordings linked on this webpage. And I'll put that in again as we go. Just a couple minutes to get started. Again, with the Q&A box is where we'll be taking your questions, and we're going to save those to the end. You can open that box. We'll have a list of running questions. There's also a chat box. You can put in any clarification questions that you have, or maybe some tech issues you might be having. Oh, awesome. Katrina shared a book link, The Last Butterflies, in the chat box if you want to check that out. And I show we're at the top of the hour, so let's go ahead and get started. Good morning, everyone. I'm Denise Ellsworth with Ohio State University Department of Entomology, where I coordinate pollinator education for the state. So excited to have you here as part of our one-week virtual insect university. If you've been coming every morning this week, welcome back. If you're new to today's session, I'll give you a little overview of how we'll be running this session. We do have a Q&A box, and that's where we'll take questions from participants. So as we go, if you have questions, or at the end, you can put your questions in. Jennifer Thieme, our presenter this morning, is going to stick around a few minutes afterwards to try to answer as many questions as she can before her next engagement. So we'll use the Q&A box for that. There's also a chat box. So if you have comments or problems, questions, technical issues, you can put those in the chat box. I'm joined this morning by Marcia Karsten, who is helping me moderate this session. She's one of our pollinator specialist volunteers and also a Xerces ambassador. So thanks to Marcia for her help. We are recording this session, and we have a web page that I put the address in the chat box. We have a web page for the entire week, and under each speaker we have links they've suggested, resources, websites. You saw I did lots of typing yesterday to keep up with Olivia Carroll and all the wonderful papers she highlighted. Those, for the most part, are all listed on that resource page, and I'll keep updating that as we go through the week. I'll add links that Jennifer suggests, book suggestions, that sort of thing, ending up with tomorrow's presenter, Doug Tallamy. So you can keep going back to that webpage. I'll just kind of leave that up. I'm linking the recordings there. So under the title of the recording, that'll be a hot link. The title of the webinar will be a hot link to the recording, so you can come back and watch the recordings if you missed any of the webinars. So the one-week Insect University started last year. Actually, the one-day Insect University started last year in Columbus, where we met for a full day, listening to lots of great bug-loving speakers. We wore bug clothes, and some people wore bug costumes and bug jewelry, and had a full day learning together and sharing about insects. Couldn't do that this year because of the pandemic, so we decided to do a virtual one-week Insect University where we'd have an awesome webinar presenter every day this week. So I do want to acknowledge our supporters, our funders of this program. I have a grant from NIFA, USDA's IPM Integrated Pest Management Pollinator Health grant. That helps to support this program, and also the Manitou Fund, who has generously contributed to help us with pollinator outreach. So many thanks to our two funders. So at this time, I'd like to introduce Jennifer Thieme, who's with us from the Monarch Joint Venture, which is a fairly new nonprofit group. They've actually been around for quite a while, but they formed a nonprofit in 2019, based out of the Twin Cities, but really working nationwide and beyond to pull partners together to help conserve monarchs. Jennifer actually is an OSU alum, so go Bucks, Jennifer. She was in our School of Environment and Natural Resources, where she studied natural resources, fisheries, and wildlife before joining the joint venture. So Jennifer, excited to have you here this morning. We were just chatting before the session started that she had come to teach monarch monitoring protocol to some of our volunteers. It seems like ages ago. It was only about 1.5 years ago, but the pandemic kind of changes time perspective. But I'm so glad to have you here, Jennifer, and excited to hear what you have to share with us.
Thanks, Denise. I appreciate the introduction. Yeah, my name's Jennifer Thieme. I'm the Regional Monitoring Coordinator with the Monarch Joint Venture. I can share my screen now, Denise, if that's good to go. Okay, we should be switching over now to my PowerPoint slide, the header slide. I'll be here to, for the next 15 minutes or so, to talk about monarch biology and conservation in a very, very broad perspective. So kind of the 10,000-foot overview, talk a little bit about their biology, what their status is right now, what their population is, how we're monitoring it. So just let me know, Denise, if I lose connection or anything like that at some point. Everything looks great. All right, thank you. as Denise was saying, the Monarch Joint Venture, it's a coordinating body. It's a partnership organization that has over 80 official partners. We foster communications around monarch conservation and their migration. All of our partners are working in some component or another to improve monarch populations, conduct monarch research, and ultimately conserve the monarch butterfly migration. So there's strength in that. None of these entities, you know, we've got all of their logos managed to fit on one page here, make them real small, but they don't have to give up their identity or their mission. There's strength in the variety of organizations we have within our partnership. So anything from a small local nature center to state level departments of natural resources up to the federal organizations, federal agencies, Fish and Wildlife Service, USGS. So we work across that spectrum, and all of those organizations have their strengths, which is great because they bring them all to the partnership. We've been around for over 10 years. We've been working through as a component of the University of Minnesota, and as Denise mentioned, just kind of branched out on our own as a standalone nonprofit in 2019. So the monarch scientific name is Danaus plexippus, and it evolved in North America. It migrated from north to south, depending on the season, still does. And occasionally monarchs migrated off course, and they'd get blown over across the Atlantic or Pacific Ocean. The plant that they rely on, and we'll talk about that a little bit later, is milkweed, a genus of plants. And that type of plant wasn't really found across the Atlantic or the Pacific. And so they couldn't, if they were blown across those regions, they couldn't breed there. So there weren't established populations until around the mid 1800s, at which point humans, both intentionally and unintentionally, facilitated the spread of certain milkweed species. And so as those milkweed species started to become established across the oceans, monarchs did too. So when they occasionally did get blown off course, they could actually end up somewhere and be able to breed. So there are small populations of monarchs across the Atlantic and the Pacific from the Americas, but the majority of the monarch population is in North and Central America. So you'll see a dashed line that just appeared around over the Rocky Mountains in North America. The North American population is kind of subdivided into two subpopulations. We have what's called the Eastern and the Western population. So what's east of the Rocky Mountains or west of the Rocky Mountains. Those populations intermingle very little. They do intermingle some. There's more research being conducted on the degree to which they intermingle, but for the most part, monarchs breeding east of the Rockies tend to stay east of the Rockies. They overwinter in central Mexico, and then monarchs west of the Rockies, breeding west of the Rockies, will overwinter on the California coast. And so they're pretty distinct populations with a little bit of intermingling. The monarchs undergo complete metamorphosis. So you might have talked about this type of metamorphosis throughout your other presentations this week. Their life cycle consists of 4 stages. So we start with the egg, we've got larvae, so that caterpillar stage, the pupa or chrysalis, and then the adult monarch. So it takes monarchs about a month to grow and change through all these stages. When the monarch lays an egg, and it only lays eggs on milkweed plants, so the Asclepias genus of plants, it'll lay about 300 to 500 eggs through its lifespan. So only lays them on milkweed. Survival is really low. And that egg takes about 3 to 5 days to hatch, depending on the temperature. And then it hatches into the larvae, so a very small caterpillar emerges from that egg. That larvae takes about 9 to 14 days to mature. It goes through a couple stages we'll talk about in a moment. And the pupae also takes about 9 to 14 days. And then the adult is alive for about 2 to 5 weeks if it's in the summer during its breeding season. And then there's a special case of monarchs, a generation of monarchs that can live 6 to 9 months. And that's the monarch that flies from the northern breeding grounds all the way down to central Mexico and overwinters there through the fall and winter. So here's a nice image showing the monarch egg and larval life stages. We've got the egg up in the upper left-hand corner there. And the larval life stages, so these phases, there are 5 phases of the larvae. Through their metamorphosis, these also go through 5 instars during their caterpillar phase. So the instar is the period between larval molts. So these larvae will molt their skin, and then there'll be some changes in their physical appearance after they molt that skin. The egg, to identify it, when you're looking at milkweed plants, you look for a little kind of creamish colored egg that's about the size of a tip of a pencil. It's got a pointed tip, kind of this football shape. It's got very noticeable ridges, especially if you take a little hand lens out with you, get a good look at it, or even take a picture with your phone and then zoom in on the picture on your phone. You can see those little ridges. So those are some distinguishing characteristics that tell you that it is, in fact, a monarch butterfly egg. Those eggs are laid on all parts of milkweeds at any stage of the milkweed growth. So you can see here we have some eggs on some milkweed that has just emerged from the ground very early in the season. They'll also lay eggs on the milkweed stems, on the flower buds, on the flower petals themselves. So if you're looking for eggs, make sure to look for eggs on all of those parts of the plant. When the egg hatches after about 3 to 5 days, the larvae actually eats its way out of the egg. The head will turn black, so you'll know, if you find an egg that it's close to emerging because of the black head. They'll eat their way out. It's a high protein meal, and then that larvae will be on that milkweed leaf. It's going to snip away or chew away those trichomes, or those hairs on the leaf, and expose the leaf itself, and that's what it starts to eat. It'll eat the leaf. That brings us to a little note about the cardinalites and toxicity of milkweed. So you might have heard that monarch larvae or monarchs are toxic. They're poisonous to their predators, potential predators, and that's because of the cardinaloids that they sequester as they eat the milkweed leaf. So the cardinaloids are chemical within the milkweed latex that accumulates within the larval stage. And so as they eat it, they actually accumulate those toxins, and then vertebrate predators are actually, they have adverse reactions to eating those larvae, which is why they don't eat them, really. There are a few vertebrate predators down in their overwintering grounds in central Mexico that are specially adapted to eat them. But for the most case, their primary predators are invertebrates, so ants and spiders, other insects that are not affected by those cardinaloids. A little bit about the larval anatomy. As with all insects, monarchs have 6 legs. Don't let all these leg-looking things on these caterpillars trick you. At the larval stage, their 6 true legs are up front. They're on their thorax near their head. And then there are 5 pairs of prolegs on their abdomen. So prolegs are kind of a false leg or a leg-like feature on their abdomen. The protuberances on their head or near their head and near their rear are not antennae. Those are actually tentacles. So those tentacles are sensory organs. They help the larvae navigate. They've got poor sight. These help them feel around on the leaf and in the monarch, or excuse me, on the milkweed. Little zoom in on the head. Those 2 big capsules on the top are the head capsules. They're not actually the eyes or the eyeballs. You can see the eyes are actually a lot lower. There are 6 pairs of the eyes, very simple eyes. They've got poor eyesight. That's why they need that tentacles to help them move around. They've got a little spinneret down at the bottom. That's what they use for spinning a little silk pad to hang their pupa from as they pupate. So the first instar, we talked about it having a black head. That's how you know it's the first instar. They don't develop their iconic striping until they've eaten some more milkweed, usually just more noticeable in their second instar. So you notice that their tentacles are barely visible as well. You see these little nub-like features toward the head and toward the rear that will eventually grow into full tentacles. Now, after a few days, it'll molt its skin, and the second instar caterpillars emerge, they start to show the more characteristic striping pattern. You can see that the tentacles are now more visible on the front and the rear. Those tentacles are still really small. We'll talk about looking at the lengths of them, but to tell that it's a second instar, those tentacles are visible, but if you were to flip them forward, try to aim them towards the front of the head, they would not get anywhere near the tip of the nose or the tip of the face there. The caterpillars chew in a kind of circular or semi-moon or crescent shape. So there's some distinguishing characteristics about their chew pattern that can tell you that if you're looking at a milkweed, that it's been there recently or it's present and chewing away at that leaf. The third instar, the tentacles would extend to the tip of the nose or the forehead if you were to bend them forward. The striping is even more apparent. They continue to eat in that kind of cutting motion. The fourth instar has tentacles that would extend beyond the tip of the head. So if you get kind of a side view of this larvae, you'll see that the tentacles go well beyond the front of the face, the tip of the head, and they're more or less straight. When they become a fifth instar, those tentacles are actually droopy, so they extend well beyond the front of the head and start to droop with their length and their weight. Just before they pupate, the monarch larvae spin a silk mat from their spinneret that we talked about earlier from the face components. And they hang upside down from that silk mat by their last pair of prolegs, like way on the back of their body. It sheds its skin for one last time and then exposes the pupae. And so it hangs from there for about 8 to 14 days and forms the adult body within that pupal, within that chrysalis. You'll notice if you look closely at these pictures, you can actually see that there are shapes. There's a form of an adult butterfly in there. The butterfly is forming, and it continues to form. It has started to form as soon as that pupa is developed. What it doesn't do, and kind of a myth out there, is that it turns to goo inside that pupa or it liquefies. It does not do that. There's a structure in there, and it continues to grow throughout that pupation phase. After pupating, it ecloses. The adult emerges from the pupa. It takes about 5 to 10 minutes for it to emerge, and then another day for the wings to harden. So it'll hang there from the pupa or from a stick that the pupa was on as it pumps these fluids from its body, from its abdomen into its wings, and then allows time for those wings to kind of harden up for flight. The adults are sexually dimorphic. So males are slightly larger than females. It's nothing that you can tell in the field, but if you had them in hand and had some measurements, the males are slightly larger. They have a black spot or a black patch of endocrinial scales on each hide wing. So you'll see on the left, that white arrow is pointing to these little black spots. Those are noticeable in the field. So if you take your binoculars out, you take a look at these monarchs on your garden flowers, and you see that patch of scales with endocrinial scales, that's a male monarch. In other butterfly species, those scales are used to release pheromones. They're not used in that way in monarchs, but it is at least a distinguishing characteristic to help you tell the male from the female. And then on the right, we have a picture of a female. It's got thicker venation on the hind wings. So that's noticeable as well, but definitely look for the black spot, the endocrinial scales. With regard to their life cycle, I'm going to start here in the winter at the beginning of the year, and January and February, this fourth generation. So the generation that was, the fourth generation from the previous year has been overwintering in central Mexico. So it's the beginning of the year. And then around March and April, that those adults that have been overwintering for months in central Mexico start to migrate north. They move with the weather. They follow the emergence of milkweed as it starts to emerge further and further north. So you'll see that boundary in the southern US of the outline of about where this fourth generation reaches and then lays eggs. And the new first generation of this year is emerges as born in the southern US. So that first generation migrates further north. And you'll see generations 2, 3, and 4 are spread out all over the northern United States and southern Canada. Those generations, there's not a distinct line where you can say this is where, the latitude of generation 2, 3, and 4. It does vary depending on year, the weather. There can be some intermingling, but those second, third, and fourth generations are breeding in this general region through the summer and into late summer. Then come early fall, those monarchs will start to migrate all the way back down to central Mexico. So that's kind of the special generation of monarchs. It gets an extra long lifespan, and they get to fly those 3,000 miles you've probably heard about, a very long flight all the way down to central Mexico and overwinter for those 6 months of winter. There is a little overwintering population, a year-round breeding population in the central Florida as well. Throughout that whole life cycle, they have needs. We talked about milkweed being the only plant that they lay their eggs on. It's also a nectar resource. They also need nectar resources throughout their entire life cycle. These are especially critical on fall migration as they put on weight and when they fly south. So they do need ample amounts of nectar resources on that journey south, as well as throughout the rest of the year. During the winter months, they overwinter in central Mexico. I'm going to zoom in here a little bit on the area where they overwinter is between the states of Mexico City and Michoacan. So you see that black circle there. I'll zoom in a little further. This is the Monarch Butterfly Biosphere Reserve. It's been, parts of it are protected in different ways. And so right along that state line, that black ridge, that mountain ridge up there, there are several different preserved areas where they overwinter. And they go to the same areas year after year. They overwinter in the Oyamel fir trees, Abies religiosa. They occur in a small area of mountaintops in central Mexico, in the area we just looked at. It's about 3,000 meters above sea level. They're on steep southwest facing slopes. The monarchs need water for moisture to keep them moist through the winter. They can get that from the fog and the clouds in that area. There's also watering. They can drink water from like puddles and streams, and they do that. I'll show you an image and a few slides here. The protective trees, these Oyamel fir trees, they soften the wind, they shield the butterflies, kind of create this special microclimate that keeps them at the right temperature, the right conditions, and protects them from extreme weather events. While they're overwintering, the monarchs roost, and so they roost in clusters and in colonies, very tightly packed on these Oyamel fir trees. That again is another kind of thermodynamic, thermoregulation method so that they can maintain the right temperatures. So they will leave on warm sunny days. They'll go fly around and look for nectar resources or water resources. So that was them in flight, and here's an example of them taking some of those resources on their overwintering grounds. Now, because the monarch goes to known areas overwintering, it's kind of convenient for counting them or estimating a population size. So since the mid-90s, their population size has been quantified in central Mexico by basically mapping the area, the land area that these roosts cover. So we're not counting, or researchers are not out there counting individual monarchs, but rather the acreage or the hectares that they cover each winter. And that can vary greatly depending on a lot of factors. So here's their population size since the mid-90s. You can see in general some decreases. And then in the Western US, when the monarchs breeding west of the Rocky Mountains go to California and overwinter, there are actually few enough of them that they can be counted or estimated individually. And so researchers go out to known overwintering sites in California And we'll actually estimate how many individual monarchs are there at these different roosting sites, which have kind of a smaller number of monarchs that can be counted. Some of the threats, I guess I'll go back a slide real quick here, and you'll notice also kind of a decreasing trend. And what's not on here is the most recent count, which is also extremely low, just under 30,000 individuals in the West. And that's very problematic. It's actually below certain thresholds for maintaining population viability. So some of the threats to those monarchs, why are their populations declining? Well, habitat loss on the overwintering grounds has historically been an issue. It's less of an issue these days because of some of the protective measures that are in place and because of some of the community supporting programs that are in place. So working to create jobs in the ecotourism industry, create kind of financial incentives for protecting these resources, but that's relatively new in the past 10 or so years. And prior to that, there was a lot of illegal logging on the overwintering grounds that contributed greatly to losing these special places where the monarch had to overwinter. There are also habitat loss issues on the breeding grounds. So of course we have development all over the breeding grounds, cutting into areas that otherwise they could breed on. Another major threat is basically Roundup ready or glyphosate ready or herbicide tolerant crops. That has eliminated a lot of milkweed, billions and billions of stems of milkweed from within agricultural areas. So where there used to be a small to moderate density of milkweed growing within crop rows, it's basically absent at this point. So they've lost those milkweed stems and can no longer breed on thousands and thousands of acres that used to be available to them for breeding. There's also a disease that's growing in the south. It's expanding north and west a little bit. And there is a citizen science project to help track and monitor that. Ophrocystis electrosclera is a protozoan that affects monarchs and queen butterflies, which is a closely related species in the Southwest. It multiplies within the larvae. So there's a spore that will end up on a milkweed leaf. The larvae ingests that spore, and then that spore multiplies within the larvae, and then at the last few days of the pupal stage, it produces new spores that are on the butterfly scale when it emerges as an adult. So then those spores can be transferred from the adult onto the milkweed leaf as it flies around and nectars and lays eggs, and that starts the cycle again of spreading this disease. Some other threats are climate change, pesticides, and vehicle collisions. So the photo on the left is from what's known as the St. Patrick's Day event, which was a snowstorm on St. Patrick's Day several years ago in their overwintering grounds. And so where they need to rely on kind of stable climates and this microclimate, that's the whole reason that they go down to this particular area every year. As our climate changes, there are more severe winter storms that can cause more mortality. They also freeze at a higher temperature when they're wet. And so if these monarchs get wet, they might freeze at a higher temperature that they could otherwise withstand if they had drier conditions. Collisions with vehicles are a real factor for mortality, and there's been some research on the conditions that can help improve that, such as certain types of roadside mowing at certain times, the speed limit, or the amount of traffic on roads. And so they've found that kind of the mid-sized roads tend to be the most detrimental to monarchs for vehicle collisions, because if it's a small, low traffic road, you have a low speed and the monarchs can kind of avoid cars and the risk is really low. If you have a big high traffic interstate, the monarchs will actually kind of fly right over the top of the vehicle and get get blown away instead of actually hit, as opposed to a county road where it's 50, 55 miles an hour. You've got a moderate amount of traffic and can have higher collisions. Pesticides can be a threat as well, directly to the monarch. So we've got all these declines in the eastern and western population. There have been, due to those drastic declines, the species has been petitioned for protection under the Endangered Species Act. So right now, the Fish and Wildlife Service has until June of 2019 to decide whether or not to list monarchs as threatened, as has been petitioned. We have this goal, this tri-national goal of achieving a stable level of 6 hectares of overwintering monarchs to maintain a healthy population. There's been research to show, like some population viability analyses that show if we have many, many years of populations below that 6 hectare threshold, it's actually too few individuals to maintain a healthy population and puts that whole migration in jeopardy. And so in 2014, leadership from Canada, US, and Mexico got together and had that conversation and wrote up a pollinator protection plan. And they set a goal of achieving the 6 hectares, excuse me, that all 3 nations are working toward. There's also a population goal for the Western monarchs, and that's at least 30 million monarchs. You see we've been below that for the 2018 here and also in the most recent count in 2019. So that's pretty troubling. Again, that's based on some population viability analyses that show less than 30 million individuals, kind of creates this vortex that could lead to extinction of the migration and the healthy population. So back to the petitioning for being listed as threatened under the Endangered Species Act. The Fish and Wildlife Service has been working on this for several years. They need more, they're gathering a bunch of information to make that decision. They're looking at the whole landscape, including threats and stressors to the population, gathering information on conservation efforts that are affecting the population, and also projecting the future population size. So that they were expected to release this decision last June, but they actually pushed it back to December of 2020. And so we're still waiting. We're just 2 months out from this listing decision. So in December, we'll have a decision, but it doesn't mean that monarchs are immediately listed if that's the case. That could take another year. I'll go through the options that could happen here. One of the options is that the Fish and Wildlife Service decides that listing is not warranted. So they collect all this information and decide that the population is stable. There's a lot of good conservation efforts underway, and the projections are looking good for their population. And so that would be the ending of this ESA process. They could decide that listing is warranted, but it's precluded by species of higher priority. So then in that case, they would review their findings each year, take a look at the monarch population and the status, and consider new information until some future year where they make a decision to either list or decide that the listing's not warranted. So there is actually kind of this waiting list to get on the endangered species list. A third outcome is that listing is warranted. So they would say, yes, this petition is appropriate. We recommend listing under the Endangered Species Act as threatened. And they would make that proposal. It doesn't mean that they would list it immediately. There would actually be a year-long process to collect basically input from a variety of sectors that would be involved. It would be a very complicated process because this monarch is such a generalist. There are a lot of land uses and stakeholders that would be involved, and they would have a year to be heard in an organized way. There is also something called 4D considerations. So if listing is warranted, if it's warranted as threatened, it doesn't come with the specific protections that being listed as endangered comes with. And so this 4D rule or 4D considerations is the opportunity for the Fish and Wildlife Service to put some flex into those rules. And so that's what would come out of that whole year-long process of figuring this out and hearing from stakeholders, is to allow certain activities. So for example, when the wolves were listed under the Endangered Species Act, there was a special 4D rule that allowed them to be shot if they were being, if they were taking people's cattle, if they were a threat to that component. So that's the type of thing that could happen with a 4D consideration. There's a lot of conservation action undergoing right now. There's been research to show what we need to support those 6 hectares of overwintering monarchs. What we need is a lot more opportunity for reproduction. So we talked about them only reproducing on milkweed. We talked about the threats that have been removing milkweed from their breeding landscape in terms of development and changes in agricultural practices. In order to reach that 6 hectare threshold, we need to basically double the amount of milkweed stems we have on the ground. So that's about 1.3 billion additional milkweed stems on the ground. So states have taken on a certain proportion of these stems as their own responsibility. There's been some great collaborations among states and regions for them to take responsibility for achieving some of these milkweed stem additions in a way that works for them. So most of the states in the core areas of monarch production have committees and working groups that represent a variety of sectors, like conserved lands. They're working with people in developed open spaces, people in agriculture, people in rights of ways, to find ways that each of those sectors can contribute to this goal. One unique conservation activity is the Candidate Conservation Agreement with Assurances. This is something that will be a way that thousands and thousands of acres are actually protected in rights of ways. Rights of ways are unique in that they tend to be maintained in grassland type conditions. You think under power line corridors, along roadsides, over gas pipelines. There's actually an opportunity for conservation there. And in a way, they're already maintaining some sort of habitat for monarchs and other pollinators. This Candidate Conservation Agreement with Assurances is a way for them to kind of formalize that. There are very specific rules and ways that they can enroll their acres and say, hey, we're already doing some of these actions. We're going to take these certain additional actions to make sure that X number of acres are protected. There are specific management rules and protocols that they can choose from to maintain the condition in good condition. There's certain monitoring that is required to know that they do have milkweed on site and know that they do have a certain amount of nectar resources on site. If they subscribe to that Candidate Conservation Agreement with Assurances, or CCAA, then additional regulations can't be imposed upon them if the species is listed. So it's kind of a win-win situation where it still is technically voluntary, and it comes with the benefit of not having additional regulations imposed as long as you're abiding within the rules that you agreed to when you signed up. So that's got a lot of industry stakeholders actually signing up right now. It was just recently formalized. Community science is another way to be involved. There are so many opportunities. I wouldn't have time to get into them all right here, right now. But as Denise said, I came down to teach in person one of the many methods of monitoring monarchs and their habitat back last January in 2019. We also expect to have some field crews in the area next summer, 2021, to connect people with some of these monitoring methods. There are ways that you can explore monarch habitat, tract habitat, see how much milkweed is on certain land use types. You can track survival through some of these community science programs, tracking disease, so that Ophrocystis electroscura, that OE protozoan we talked about earlier. There's a way that you can actually test your monarchs for that, take a little sample of scales from them and send that into the University of Georgia, who will test them and then get you back your results and tell you, hey, you had OE on this many monarchs or no monarchs. They'll look at it under a microscope for you. There are community science programs that allow you to track migration. So whether there's a program called Journey North where you can log into your computer and just record when and where you see monarchs. They're attempting to track the monarch migration north and south to the best of their abilities, using that kind of crowd sharing information of where are monarchs, who's seeing them, and where are they and when. You can also track migration by tagging monarchs. There's a program called Monarch Watch that will give you stickers that you capture monarchs, or if you're rearing monarchs, you would put them on your reared monarchs in the fall. And then they fly with those stickers all the way down to central Mexico. And there are researchers actually looking to collect those stickers so that they can see what proportion of monarchs make it down there, as well as where they're coming from and which of those clusters or roosts or colonies that they go to. There are community science programs that allow you to monitor reproduction. So whether you're tracking monarch eggs and larvae over time in your garden on milkweed stems, that might be an option. Some people rear some monarchs and track the reproduction, and always report on your rearing outcomes to make sure you're contributing to community science. So there's a bunch of opportunities. I'll send some links to Denise so you can dig into whichever ones are of interest to you. You can also visit the Monarch Joint Venture for more info. We've got a great community science page where you can flip through all of these options and be connected with whichever one works for you. So one of the maybe biggest things that you can do for monarch conservation is to share your story. So you have a passion. You're here today. You're interested in pollinators in general. You're interested in this type of habitat. You're looking to do something with an impact, and sharing your story can have a huge impact on your friends and your neighbors or your legislators or whoever you're sharing that story with. There are a lot of programs that can get you yard habitat science. So maybe you just converted part of your yard to a pollinator habitat, and you want your neighbors to know, you want to take pride in that, and also know that, that you're maintaining that with intent. It's not just a weedy yard that got out of control. That's actually intentional and purposeful. So these habitat signs are a good way to share that story. When you're buying plants, request native plants at any garden center you go to. The more they hear those requests, the more they're going to be able to respond to that demand. So be asking for that, and talk to people at your garden centers why it's important to have more native plants available for purchase. And then, of course, educating others. There are a lot of opportunities to just share your story or informally or formally with others. Share what you know about monarchs and pollinators, bring something into the classroom, give your own PowerPoint, something like that. So that can be a really impactful way to increase conservation of monarchs and pollinators in general. So I'll leave you with this website here. This is monarchjointventure.org. It's got all resources, all kinds of resources on monarch biology. If you wanted to dig a little more into some of the things I talked about, if you're really curious about Ophrocystis electroscura, if you want to learn more about the ins and outs of the Cardinalites and the milkweed, and they actually vary among milkweed species. So you can learn a little bit more about that. You want to learn about actions that you can take, or some of these community science programs that we talked about, We have a way on here to map your habitat. So basically you can put a pin on a map and say, I did do this in my yard. I want to be recognized. It's really cool to see all of those efforts across the US on this map. We have outreach materials. So if you are sharing your story, if you're going into a classroom, we can actually provide you with some nice glossy handouts that talk about a whole variety of these topics. There are also fundraising opportunities. So there's a program right now we encourage people to participate in called Miles for Monarchs. And it's a way to set up something locally, like a run or a little event, a canoe trip, whatever. And social distancing, keeping that in mind. We've still had plenty of success doing that within social distancing measures, but that's an opportunity to raise funds for a local habitat project yourself, and we can offer guidance on setting that up. So that's what I had to share with you for today. I'll leave it open for questions.
Great, thanks, Jennifer. Really nice overview, some beautiful images as well. Let's start with maybe the elephant in the room, which is I don't think I heard you mention rearing monarchs indoors. Do you and Monarch Joint Venture have a philosophy on that?
We do, and we have a good glossy handout on it as well. I'll share the link with you later. But that's something that can be a useful educational tool. So it can be appropriate for sharing with a classroom. It can be appropriate for personally finding enjoyment in rearing a few caterpillars. We don't see it as, and it's not regarded as something that will be good for boosting the population of monarchs in general. It can cause a variety of problems. There's a lot of research going into that right now. One of the most well-known issues that's been known for a while is it can potentially spread disease. When people are rearing hundreds of monarchs at a time, things can get sloppy. Even if you're rearing them in a disease-free environment, we're learning more about potential compromises that are made within the health of those reared monarchs, whether they're not able to orient appropriately and really fly south to overwinter as they need to do. They can be weaker or paler. So on an individual basis, you can have an impact by sharing that story maybe and making it a part of your story, but as rearing as a way to bulk up the population is not something that we recommend.
Okay, great, thanks. Do you, folks, I put up on the screen the book that Jennifer recommended, Monarchs and Milkweed, and that's one of the books that if you are selected, if you rate today's webinar, you get put in a drawing, and if you are selected, you get to choose a book. And so Jennifer suggested Monarchs and Milkweed. Do you want to say a few things about this book, Jennifer?
Yeah, this is a fun one because it's beautiful. It's got a lot of colored pictures in there. It's written in a very understandable way, and it's really interesting. It has a lot about the chemistry behind the Cardinalites and Milkweed and kind of this arms race of in between the two components here. Cardinalites are kind of a defense for milkweeds so that insects don't eat them. And yet here we have monarchs who are specialists on them. And so it tells a little bit about that story. And it's a really nice read.
Awesome, thanks. So there were a lot of questions about milkweeds. So do you have certain types of milkweed that you recommend? Does it depend regionally? What's your thought on that?
Yes, yes, and yes. It does depend on your region. We do have resources on our website, a milkweed handout that tells you what's appropriate to plant in your region. In Ohio, one of the easiest ones, of course, is common milkweed. It's very widespread throughout the eastern U.S. It's widespread throughout Ohio, and you can probably get some seeds pretty easily. It establishes pretty well, and it's kind of a generalist, so it'll tolerate some moist conditions up to pretty dry conditions. So that's a good starter one. Swamp milkweed is great. There's been some research that shows monarchs tend to lay more eggs on swamp milkweed. That doesn't mean you should always and only plant swamp milkweed because there can be some some underlying issues there. It also has a lower level of cardinalites. And so those larvae potentially don't have quite as strong of a defense if they're coming from swamp milkweed. If you're in a shady area and you don't have habitats that can support most of the milkweed species that can survive that specialize in kind of the open areas, poke milkweed is one to consider for your more dappled, shady areas. They'll lay eggs on that. Monarchs do enter shady areas, lightly forested areas, so that can be an opportunity as well. Fence it off from rabbits.
Awesome. How about the tropical milkweed? There was a question about that.
Good, I'm glad you brought that up. Tropical milkweed is not native to the U.S. It's native to further south and central U.S. It is not recommended because that's actually contributing to some of the spread of OE down in the southern U.S. This non-native milkweed it doesn't die back every year. So when it doesn't die back every year, you have the potential to accumulate more of that protozoa, that disease, those spores on those milkweed stems. And that's happening down in the southern US. Now, in Ohio, maybe you think, well, it gets real cold where I am. It is dying back in the winter, or I can cut it back in the winter. We just don't recommend bringing a non-native species into your garden. It also creates kind of this demand and impression that that's a good one to be planting for monarchs. And in general, it is not something that we want to be planted more in the US. There are a lot of great other options.
Great, thanks. So there was a question as to whether 1 or 2 milkweed plants, can that be enough? Does that make a difference?
It does make a difference. One plant can support, well, it depends on the species, but like a common milkweed plant would support a larvae. They'll eat several of the leaves. They'll just kind of work their way up or down. Might eat up most of that one plant, but it's definitely worth it. And it's also providing a nectar resource. So even if you don't get reproduction on it, you've got that flower there that's available for the adults that are flying by.
Okay, if an egg is laid on a common milkweed plant, will that larva stay on the common milkweed or travel to other species, other milkweeds?
Mm-hmm. They can, when they're older, travel to other plants. So if you've got a patch of common milkweed, they can move from plant to plant. They don't move much more than 10 meters or so. And they'll actually, when it gets real hot outside in the heat of the summer, you might have trouble finding the larvae on the plants because they'll actually travel down to the bottom and seek out shade at the bottom of the plant. So they're doing some traveling within the plant and among the plants.
Okay. There was a question about the toxins and how predators sense those. Are they, do they smell the toxins and that's a warning, or do they have to taste the chemical? It's a learned, the colors are the warning. That's why these larvae and the adults are so bright. So that's something that's learned, and they learn it by tasting once and not tasting again. It doesn't release to smell. So that's how they would learn. Okay. Is there a way to tell visually if an adult is infected with OE? In general, no, not with the naked eye. If you are rearing a monarch and you have really bad infections of OE, they can emerge with crumpled up wings that don't straighten out. That's really bad conditions. But otherwise, you won't be able to see visually, something in your garden that you would know that has OE. You can look under your own microscope if you have one. I think at about 200 times magnification. We'll share the process here later, but via a website link. But Monarch Health is a program that has directions on how to take a sample of scales safely from the monarch. So if you do capture it in hand and you take that little sample from its abdomen, you've got some little scales on a piece of tape. You can look for it under your own microscope if you have one. Awesome, great. So a lot of communities do, in fact, in Ohio, we have a county-wide project where folks can gather common milkweed pods and take them to their soil and water office. But I've heard kind of some pros and some cons of those kinds of programs. One of the cons I've heard is that we're reducing the regional genetic diversity by taking those seeds, centralizing them, and then spreading them back across the region. So I wonder if you have thoughts and opinions on that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that can depend which camp you come from, I guess. That's definitely something that could be of concern for if you're coming from the plant background and want to conserve that. Monarch Joint Venture doesn't have a formal opinion or statement on that. We do see the benefits of it for a lot of pollinators to have the increased number of milkweed on the ground that those programs are able to produce. So we have supported some of those programs, but I do see that I understand the point, and I don't have the background or the knowledge or the depth of research from the plant side to know that, to speak to how it might be genetically washing out that type of specialization.
Okay, great, thanks. There were a couple questions about some of those milkweed associates, like the beetles and the bugs. Do they compete with the monarchs, or should we be taking the aphids and the other critters off our plants?
Right. In general, they don't. There's not a big competition on your milkweed plant with the monarch in terms of other insects that are eating or consuming milkweed. We definitely don't recommend removing insects from your garden or even the aphids. It's something that we can track in some of our community science programs so we can learn more about the aphids. But it's part of a whole ecosystem, and we're looking to protect that whole ecosystem. And if we take that step to removing these potential competitors, or then do we take the other step of like removing all the spiders and ants because they consume the monarch eggs and larvae? And we don't want to go down that road. What we want is to have a wholesome community within that garden with a diversity of predators and prey, and a diversity of milkweed and nectar resources for all of them.
Okay, there was a question about how many are in the joint venture.
How many partners? There are, yeah, there are over 80. It changes every couple of weeks. I think we're close to 90 now.
Wow. Partners. A question about wildfires, excuse me, in California and how they may be affecting the Western monarchs.
Good question. We will find out this winter. It's been really severe. Obviously, you're well informed of the acreage that has been damaged. So that might cause some population decline. It's really hard to link things like that directly to a distinct cause. So we'll see this winter when the populations are counted in California on the coast. The Xerces Society usually comes out with a statement about what may have been contributing to those increases or declines. What might be happening now is a reduction in nectar resource availability during a critical time when they're migrating to the coast. And so I could see that having an impact of their survival getting to their overwintering grounds.
Okay, there was a question from Katrina. She asked, I'd like to convince our HOA to dedicate some shared landscape to habitat. Do you have suggestions for materials to share to help educate?
I do. On our monarchjointventure.org website, I think there's a tab called resources, and there's under resources, there's something like downloads. And I think I'll have Denise share this. It's where all of our nice glossy stuff are, the educational tools, and there's one a little more tailored toward that topic. Love to hear you bring that up, because there is so much potential there to make a beautiful space that people can enjoy instead of just wanting to mow over or something like that.
This will be a fun one to answer. I have a yellow and black striped caterpillars that ate most of my dill in the summer. What could they be?
Those are swallowtails. The black swallowtail eats dill and parsley and carrot, and they're the trickster that looks a lot like a monarch. But that's cool to hear that you had some swallowtail caterpillars in your garden.
There were a couple questions about, you mentioned roadsides as the collision issue. And so are there better practices about having roadside wildflower plantings? Should that practice be discouraged? What's your recommendation on that?
It's still being researched, so we don't have a formal, position to recommend. So I know that some, this is just a small example, but some rights of ways are not putting, some like departments of transportations are not putting nectar resources like in the median of certain highways. And so trying to keep the monarchs or other pollinators at least on the outsides, the edges of the roads, and not attracting them to come into the middle is one kind of simple technique. But other than that, there's still some research being done on, what would make these roads safer.
Okay. Mia asked, she says, it seems like hand rearing monarchs is not a good idea. I'd be happy to leave the eggs and larvae alone on plants in my yard, but they seem to be eaten, probably a predator. What should she do to protect the eggs and larvae that are actually on those plants in her garden?
That's a tough one. I faced the same thing. I had very few in my garden actually make it to the larval stage this year. And it's tough. So kind of the pie in the sky answer is more habitat and more milkweed and more nectar resources would be ideal. You are providing nectar resources that are helping the other adults that are out there. Really, that's kind of the best that we can do at this point in time. So what you are doing is fantastic. And rearing an egg for your own personal pleasure can make sense and bring joy to some people. You're thinking about, oh, I saved this individual that probably would not have survived in my garden. But that's true, but not necessarily a huge contribution to a population of 300 million monarchs or something.
Okay, I think, was it Michigan State that did some research on maybe Doug Landis cutting those milkweed plants back and reflushing? Do you have any thoughts or about that?
Yeah, they did some research on the timing of cutting or mowing milkweed. It is pretty well established that monarchs prefer to lay their eggs on kind of the younger or tender milkweed stems. And so they found that if you cut the stems back kind of mid-summer, they have time to regenerate tender new growth, and monarchs will prefer to lay their eggs on that. They're very careful about those communications. It does not mean cut all your milkweed. They kind of, I think they're finding a balance between 25% or a third of the milkweed being cut back. So you still do have a variety of stages available, and you're not cutting back everything that might be utilizing that milkweed at the time of your cut. So cutting back a small proportion of your milkweed can have the regrowth can bring in some more monarchs can be kind of more preferable for monarchs to lay their eggs on.
Great. Well, we're just a little bit after the hour. So Jennifer, thanks so much for a wonderful presentation, folks. I know she'd appreciate a thank you in the chat box. We'll add some of those resources and links to our course webpage. And I put the link to our evaluation in the box. So please remember to give us your comments about today's webinar. There's the link on the screen as well. And thanks for joining us, everyone. Thanks so much, Jennifer. And I hope to see you all tomorrow with Doug Tallamy.
Great. Thank you, everybody. Good to see you, Denise. Take care.
You too.